8 months ago, I made a Fettuccine Alfredo video requiring weeks of research that got lost in the algorithm. Then 2 weeks ago, Tasting History released his video with only about 5,000 times more views. Well, given that I have already done the research, it seems a bit of a waste to not compare our homework on the same subject. I'm not going to fact check sentence by sentence or chronologically, otherwise this video will be too messy. And I guess I have to apologize beforehand if I sound salty in this video. This is just how I sound, and naturally, I am also salty that I basically got no views. But the salt is directed at YouTube, not at Tasting History. So, with a big pinch of salt and hopes for reviving a date video, it's time for a fact check. Let's start with how they define Fettuccine Alfredo.
So Fettuccine Alfredo, or Fettuccine all'Alfredo, is a dish that has been made for so long that its origins are really lost to the mists of time. But the version that we know here in the US gets its name from Roman restaurateur Alfredo Di Lelio. And it is his version of the dish that I endeavor to recreate.
Max explains that Fettuccine Alfredo gets its name from an Italian chef, and Alfredo Di Lelio's version of the dish is also what he wants to recreate. Alfredo's Fettuccine Alfredo is simply pasta, butter, and cheese. He also said that the dish has been made for so long that it's been lost in the mists of time, which it's not really true, as you'll see later. Max later clarifies that in Italy, pasta with butter and cheese is known as something you'd whip up if you weren't feeling well.
Pasta with butter and cheese isn't really restaurant menu worthy, because in Italy, that dish was known as something that you'd whip up if you weren't feeling very well, just kind of like a comfort food. And it was usually just called fettuccine al burro, or fettuccine with butter.
Here, Max says fettuccine al burro, when it's supposed to be pasta al burro, meaning pasta with butter. And I don't think this was simply him misspeaking, since he says that multiple times throughout the video. You see, pasta al burro is also something you cook when, say, you have nothing else in the fridge. It's kinda like the Italian version of shitty food porn. When you have nothing, you can't exactly choose not to use spaghetti. As such, it doesn't make sense for such a dish to be limited to the fettuccine shape, especially when different regions of Italy have different common shapes of pasta. This kind of background story also adds context to its other names, like pasta dei cornuti, meaning Caco's pasta, which Max does mention.
Because most of Italy still calls it fettuccine al burro, or, my favorite, pasta dei cornuti, or cuckold's pasta. See, the story goes that a woman was having multiple affairs and would be with all of her lovers all day, so that when she got home, she didn't have any time left to make him a big meal. So she would just boil some pasta and throw on some butter and some Parmesan cheese, which is exactly what I'm...
One small complaint here. The way Max structures the sentence seems to imply it was a single woman that this legend came from, but I think this story was supposed to be more general. As in, since housewives had more time for domestic affairs, any husband coming home to pasta al burro, which is considered a low-effort dish, would be quite unhappy because they expected a better meal. Max does mention the earliest recording of something similar to pasta al burro.
It wasn't new, it wasn't inventive, and it had probably been made in most Italian households at least since the Middle Ages. In fact, a recipe for basically this dish appears in Maestro Martino's 15th century Libro de Arte Culinaria. And his recipe is for long, thin strips of pasta mixed with cheese and butter, and the only real difference is that he would put sweet spices on it, like sugar and nutmeg and cinnamon, because it was the Italian Renaissance and they put that stuff on absolutely everything.
And that the term macaroni was used to refer to any kinds of pasta even up until Alfredo's time.
The other difference was the name, because in Maestro Martino's time, fettuccine, the term, had not come into use, and so instead it's called macaroni romaneschi, or Roman macaroni. But even by the 20th century, by Alfredo's time, the term macaroni was still sometimes used just to refer to any pasta at all that was long and thin.
But because their research for pasta history was limited, Tasting History attributes the reason for Alfredo's success to his showmanship.
But even with the name change to fettuccine, The dish that Alfredo made his sick wife is still pretty much the same dish that people had been making for centuries. So if Alfredo's pasta was not inventive or unique, why was it such a big deal? Well, the answer is Alfredo himself.
However, this explanation fails to mention a few things. The image that Tasting History showed before is a photograph taken by Giorgio Sommer in Naples called Manggiamaccheroni, translating to macaroni eaters, or loosely translated to spaghetti eaters. Vendors eating these long strands of pasta as a form of show were a common sight in Naples during the 19th century, like in this photograph by an unknown author or this engraving by Bartolomeo Pinelli. In John Lawson Stoddart's collection of travel lectures, he noted how tourists have watched macaroni being made by filthy men amidst the dust, rags and wretchedness of the Neapolitan streets. The entertainment from macaroni comes not necessarily from eating the pasta themselves, but rather by paying for groups of the lazzaroni, the poor lower class who were often beggars, to eat macaroni by the fistfuls. As John recollects, he paid a vendor to distribute 20 plates, hoping to watch the lazzaroni eat for amusement. But watching such exhibitions of people literally snatching food and shoving scalding mixtures down their throats was more distressing than he initially thought. It was a realization that in front of him was real poverty, rather than some kind of scripted comedy act.
Grazie, grazie tante. Buongiorno.
He also later learned that on average 4 or 5 people die daily of starvation. Unlike his street counterparts, Alfredo's restaurant was basically a tourist trap. Rome was one of the most visited cities in the past 2 millennia, and both the old and new restaurants were located near popular tourist locations, like the Vatican and the Piazza Navona. In other words, Alfredo's restaurant provided tourists a sanitized version of experiencing Manggiamaccheroni. Visitors are able to eat a better prepared version of pasta al burro with high quality ingredients in comparison to the pork grease, salt and cheese of unknown qualities on the streets. In addition, they are also shielded from the realities of poverty in Italy. To be clear, I'm not trying to take away anything from the chef Alfredo's culinary skills or personability. The point I'm trying to make is that the ideas contributing to the dish's success were clearly more than just one chef coming up with a recipe and then it just got popular. Whether a conscious decision or not, there were obvious cultural influences and references leading up to the quote-unquote creation of the dish Fettuccine Alfredo. In Tasting History's video, more than 8 minutes was dedicated to reiterating the corporate history of Alfredo Di Lelio's life, from how he cooked a pasta dish with butter and Parmesan cheese for his sick pregnant wife. Hey, editing fat boy here. So I realized that Tasting History's editing seemed to imply that this woman down here is Alfredo Di Lelio's wife.
A young man, Alfredo Di Lelio, frets over the health of his young wife, Ines, who is pregnant with their first.
But in the full image, you can see that this lady is just a random customer. Okay, back to the video. To how the restaurant gained popularity with tourists and Hollywood stars, to him selling his restaurant and then coming back years later to open another restaurant, resulting in a decades-long rivalry. But as you can probably already tell, this isn't how food history is studied. In food historian Lynn Over's food timeline, it is noted under Fettuccine Alfredo that most dishes are not created, they evolve. She then lists some recipes across various years with varying similarities to Fettuccine Alfredo, and noting that the earliest recipe they have attributing the chef Alfredo to the dish is in 1928, 1 year after the Hollywood stars Fairbanks and Pickford encounter. Fettuccine Alfredo wasn't lost to the mists of time. It was simply the product of a long history of pasta being dressed with different ingredients, being eaten by different people, called different names, and presented differently. Looking at these sources individually, in the book Pasta, a Universal Food by historian Silvano Saventi and anthropologist Francois Saban, cheese was a constant companion of pasta since it was introduced in the 12th century, sometimes accompanied by a sprinkle of cinnamon. At the turn of the 17th century, a recipe for Venetian-style macaroni involved cutting dough into long strips or squares of macaroni, served seasoned with fresh butter and grated Parmesan cheese and sprinkled with cinnamon. Now, it is important to note that Food Timeline, as comprehensive as it is simply a resource for researching food history. Outside of the sources she listed, there is also a recipe by Martino da Como, an Italian chef considered to be unequaled in culinary skills during the 15th century, in which he cooks pasta in fatty broth or water with fresh butter and salt, then placed on a platter with good cheese and butter and sweet spices. Going through more recipes throughout history, a recipe from the 14th century collection of medieval English recipes titled The Form of Cury has the following recipe for a cheese and pasta casserole called macaroons. All of these old recipes are similar in some ways to pasta al burro, but going back to the Food Timeline, the next earliest recipe is a 1769 recipe from the experienced English housekeeper. As you can probably tell from the name, this isn't an Italian recipe written for Italians. It was written for the British. So here's the problem when researching a usually simple dish like pasta al burro. Mixing pasta with butter and cheese isn't like making some complicated machinery. As long as people have the ingredients, they will experiment and mix them for the same reason why someone might eat fries with ice cream, or say, mixing rice with butter and soy sauce. It may not be considered particularly special to be written as a recipe unless you are writing for a non-Italian audience. Written recipes for Italians are also generally harder to find, because there was a low rate of literacy and Italians tend to view cooking as a sort of art and tradition to be passed down orally. With that in mind, even just looking at the recipe, we can see that Americans weren't even the first to add cream. The recipe also mentions an additional lump of butter rolled in flour, similar to creating a roux today, and lay all over it Parmesan cheese toasted. Comparing this recipe to our modern recipes, you can also say that this recipe is similar to not only just Fettuccine Alfredo, but also mac and cheese, and even lasagna with the toasted Parmesan cheese. And scrolling further down, we can see that macaroni al burro, which is most similar to the pasta al burro we mentioned, finally appears in a 1912 cookbook. Like the previous recipes, this was not written for Italians. Instead, this was written by a New Yorker, Mabel Earl McGuinness, using the pseudonym Antonia Isola for Americans. It is starting in 1928 that Alfredo was used as a name, 1 year after the Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks encounter. At the time, they were two of Hollywood's greatest stars, and apparently they liked Alfredo's rendition of the dish so much that they donated a set of spoon and fork made of gold with their names engraved, and named Alfredo the King of Noodles. Alfredo's restaurant was already relatively popular at this time, but that was the greatest exposure given to it by far. Hollywood stars continued to tell other Hollywood stars about this restaurant, and Alfredo's version of macaroni al burro was so popular that, naturally, people in the United States also wanted to make and try at home. And again, Alfredo was only used in cookbooks written for Americans. Ada Boni, an Italian chef and writer, had written The Talisman of Happiness, a cookbook for Italians, in 1928, but it is only in the 1950 translation for Americans that a recipe for Roman-style noodles with butter and Parmesan was added. Even so, it's only added because the recipe was popular among the translator's American friends. The translators even tried to dispel many myths Americans had about Italian cuisine, like that not all sauces included tomatoes, and that al burro e parmigiano is favoured by those with weak stomachs. And perhaps the most interesting of all, that not all Italians love pasta. Macaroni, or pasta, isn't even the preferred starch along northern and central Italy where the Valley of the Po laid. Rice and corn were preferred there, as they grew better on the belt. It is only thanks to railroads, airplanes and automobiles that northern Italians are starting to acquire the taste for pasta. This also makes sense when looking at another historical event. Italian unification took place in 1861, only just 90 years before this translation. Economic conditions, especially for the poor, had deteriorated from unification. Taxes introduced by the new government meant that the poor found it difficult to even eat, while the rich found ways to evade these taxes using connections. Most poor Italians were said to have eaten potatoes, beans or bread, while things like pasta or meat were only eaten twice a year. Understanding this context would help us understand that simultaneous to the name of Fettuccine Alfredo being used in the US, pasta al burro was also only just being accepted as a unified Italian dish. So to go back to Tasting History's video, I hope you can see just how much context is lost when only corporate history, taken only from one source, which is the restaurant franchise itself, is presented. And with those contexts, we can finally talk about the recipe for Alfredo.
Now, he never actually wrote down the recipe per se, or at least shared it, but in 1927 he did give away the secret to his dish, and it was to use the best ingredients to make his fettuccine, then a double quantity of butter and cheese, and well mixed. That is my secret.
Tasting History is actually wrong about the recipe not being revealed. Mama Leon's, an Italian-American restaurant that opened in 1906, later becoming one of the most popular restaurants in New York, published a cookbook in 1967. According to the cookbook, Alfredo, which, given the timeline likely to refer to the son or the grandson, is a good friend and gave Leon the recipe. The instructions are simply fresh pasta with lots of fresh creamery, butter and Parmesan cheese. And this might seem like the end result didn't matter. But, what does creamery butter and Parmesan cheese mean? Context is once again very important. Therein lies the problem with most no-cream fettuccine Alfredo recreations, including tasting histories. There are certain questions we still have not answered, like why did people have to resort to cream? Why did cream only catch on in America but not Italy? Although it is pretty clear to us right now that fettuccine Alfredo is simply a well-crafted version of pasta al burro, cooks were seemingly unable to reproduce the richness of Alfredo's rendition. Was Alfredo simply that good of a chef? Maybe. The Encyclopedia of American Food and Drink says that the dish was made with a very rich triple butter made by Alfredo himself, and only the heart of the best Parmigiano was used, and cooks who could not reproduce this resorted to cream. Studying the history of butter helps us understand why. American butter doesn't have as much milk fat as European butter. American style butter is churned less and tends to have 80% milk fat. And this was only a requirement made into law in the US in 1923 in what is called the Butter Act. On the other hand, European butter has more variety of milk fat depending on the region of manufacture, usually averaging 82%. A minor difference percentage-wise, but huge difference in practice. Trying to use good butter in America was only made more difficult by the invention of margarine in 1869 by French chemist Hippolyte Maurice. While margarine didn't really catch on in Italy, the invention of the margarine creating process would create a long political and legal battle between butter and margarine. Health and protecting the interests of the dairy industry were certainly concerns, but the most relevant part to our discussion for Alfredo is that fraud cases where margarine is sold as butter is common. Detectives even had to be hired for these cases of bogus butter, with the New York Times estimating a figure of 60 million pounds in weight to be in circulation in 1885. Therefore, any average American following any recipe using butter is likely to receive worse results compared to any average European. With that in mind, we can now talk about the other part of the equation, Parmesan cheese. Nowadays, we know Parmesan cheese as a shorter name for Parmigiano Reggiano, or as the processed cheese that tries to imitate Parmigiano Reggiano. But Parmigiano Reggiano only became a protected designation of origin, meaning its production and sales are legally protected and strict criteria had to be met for the cheese to be certified authentic Parmigiano Reggiano in 1955. Parmigiano Reggiano cheese production only sharply increased around the 20th century, partly due to some cheese politics too complicated to cover, and partly due to advances in agrarian science and the establishment of professional training for cheesemakers. But what this meant was, many people, including Italians, would have made pasta al burro with imitation Parmigiano Reggiano or different cheeses. Not exactly a big problem in Italy, where other Grana cheese like Grana Padano or Pecorino Romano are still pretty good. And considering the poverty, any cheese might be good cheese. But a huge problem in, say, America, where fake cheese can mean craft or wood pulp. Even today, the Parmigiano Reggiano Cheese Consortium estimates the copycat market to be worth $2 billion, a close figure to the $2.7 billion of real Parmigiano Reggiano. Fake cheese and fake butter. That certainly explains why Americans couldn't recreate Fettuccine Alfredo and had to resort to cream. Anyway, We finally have the information we have to critique tasting history. And their recipe is generally okay. Except they didn't mention the use of high fat or European butter. So now you might think, okay, I'm finally done complaining and can press dislike and report Just a Fat Boy for talking shit about your favorite YouTuber, right? Well, no. It's time to go back to the very first sentence Max says.
Today, when you order Fettuccine Alfredo at a place like the Olive Garden, you can expect a bowl of pasta drenched in a creamy and garlicky sauce. And delicious it is. But Italian, it ain't.
Italian, it ain't. I guess the question is, are Italian Americans, that is, ethnically Italian people with Italian ancestry with American passports, Italians? Well, I don't know. It's honestly a question that every descendant of an immigrant has asked themselves at some point in their lives. In the article Good Food and the Problematic Search for Authenticity, a similar question is posed to various chefs on authenticity. Wes Avila, Mexican-American chef and owner of Guerrilla Tacos, says this of the food he serves. I grew up in Los Angeles. This is the way I am cooking. So it's authentic to me. I am being true to myself. And there was a similar reply given by Naku Mahendro, first-generation Indian American and owner of Bad Mash. It's going to be an Indian restaurant. But from our perspective as Indians who have been born and raised in this part of the world. Because cultures borrow ideas from other cultures all the time, defining cuisine by the borders as we know today can be problematic. As we have covered, there was a genuine reason why cream was added to Fettuccine Alfredo. Certainly, there is also nothing wrong if you say it is not Italian, as some Italian chefs do.
You have a lot of people, the Italian especially, then tell you, this is not Italian. You're right, it's not Italian. So it doesn't make you special to make it because you're Italian. You could be Chinese, French, Japanese, it doesn't matter. What religion, of course. Where do you come from? You can make a fettuccine Alfredo however you want. Some people put eggs, some people put different cheese in it. Pecorino Romano is wonderful, but it's a little too salty for me. So Parmigiano Reggiano is a perfect cheese. And you see, look, it's thickening. It's thickening. Now, what pasta can we use? Well, fettuccine is more standard. It's more standard to use fettuccine, but you can use tagliatelle, you can use pappardelle, which is a last fettuccine. Whatever pasta you use, friends, it's up to you. There's no right or wrong or what pasta you use. It's whatever makes you happy. That's what's important.
Yet, it is also a classic dish that Italian Americans have in their repertoire.
Today we're going to make one of my favorite dishes and one of my family's favorite dishes. There's nothing traditional about this, but it's so good and you're probably very familiar with it. Let's get into making chicken fettuccine Alfredo right now.
And today I make fettuccine Alfredo. That's my favorite son-in-law he like. So I make it for him. So I make homemade fettuccine. We need the parslina, we need the burro, we need the heavy cream and pecorino romano. That's all we need. That's very simple.
That was a grandma born in Italy, now living in America, preparing fettuccine Alfredo with cream and pecorino. Something that some Italians would go cray-cray over.
Then add 3.5 cups of half and half. Bring that to a...
What was that? What was that? Was that milk? Was that cream? Alfredo doesn't use cream. Alfredo makes the cream with Parmesan and butter. I'm really not feeling good.
And let it cook for about...
As I see it as an outsider, there is actually good reason to be proud of Italian American food. And I am just going to reiterate a huge section from my previous video. After Italian unification, conditions in southern Italy had worsened due to inequitable tax burdens, soil exhaustion and erosion, and longer military conscription, among other things. The poor economic situation forced many to emigrate, most of whom went to the US, which was at the time seeking to fill the labour shortage following the Civil War. Back in Italy, eating things like potatoes, beans and bread every day was the norm, while pasta and meat were only eaten maybe twice a year. Government surveys in the 1870s estimated about 75 to 85% of the average poor Italian family's income was spent on food. This meant there was not much else for other things. Even in the 1940s, at least half of Italians eat meat only on Sundays. But in America, these Italian laborers who were once too poor for wine could, on a slim salary earned in a towel factory, buy imported rice, antipasto, wine, and meat. In America, they still spent a large proportion of their wages on food, but they were now eating whatever they want. Instead of eating meat twice a year, they were eating meat twice a week. They bought American olive oil, cheese, meat and foodstuffs and called their food Italian. Sometimes, they could even buy imported ingredients from Italy. This isn't to say that life in America wasn't hard. Most still faced real poverty, lived in cramped quarters, and had to send their children to work, and most of them faced various illnesses. But to these Italians, there was simply no comparison between Italy and the United States. Here, they don't need to starve, and had social mobility and could even start their own businesses. But no matter how poor they were, Italians made sure to eat well. It was to the point that, during the Depression, Americans even criticized them for wasting their money on expensive imported olive oil despite living in poverty. Good food literally mattered more to them than anything else. You could even say they ate as if they wanted to spite the rich in Italy, who they associated with taking away much of their rights and wages. Food that used to be revered and out of their dreams became part of their everyday life, and these helped form their new identities and connect the Italian immigrants from different backgrounds. These were Italians mostly from the south, coming from different states like Abruzzo, Molise, Campania, Apulia, Basilicata, Calabria and Sicily, just to name a few. Food started to be associated with every facade of life for the Italians in America. Much like how they saw the rich do in Italy, they socialize using food, use it to welcome neighbors, have community parties surrounded by food, and, given the lack of land, grew small community gardens on rooftops. You could even say that food was sacred, given the religious context. Italian Catholics had the tradition of enormous multi-generational extended family and community meals, especially on Sundays. People cooked together and could pass on what they knew. Italian Americans lived with each other, saw, smelled, and tasted each other's local and regional foods, and took on their own Italian identity. Since immigrants tended to work and ate lunch near the workplace, these also gave way for food wagons targeted at Italians. With food as a bonding site for Italian communities with different backgrounds, it's no surprise that local traditions became mixed. The realities of American ingredients, abundant as they may be, also meant that Italian Americans had to cook differently. For example, plum tomatoes, which were used in Italy, were suitable for making quick pasta sauces since the skin was thin and there weren't many seeds. But the tomatoes in the US at the time were not plum tomatoes and had many seeds and thicker skin. Immigrants had to deviate from traditional recipes in order to find a familiar taste. It's just adaptation in practice. Also, by the 19th century, immigrants mostly from northern Italy had already opened restaurants, and these restaurants tended to follow trends, which was French cuisine at the time. This meant a somewhat northern Italian spin, so your bolognese, lasagna, parmigianas, and tiramisu. With the southern Italians coming in afterwards, these restaurants gained a new clientele, and also new workers as waiters or line cooks. Subsequently, using the knowledge and background of Italian American food, the naturalized Italian Americans opened their own restaurants. Examples of this change could actually be seen in the earlier mentioned Lyon's cookbook, which have tried to keep the recipes as used in the restaurant scaled down for the home cook. As a reminder, the restaurant opened in 1906. Here, one of the first things we learn about cooking pasta is that while Italians liked pasta to be al dente, Americans liked it softer. In the recipe for bolognese sauce, we can also find certain things Italians in the 21st century consider forbidden, like garlic, butter, rosemary, the lack of carrots and celery, no milk to finish the sauce, and saying to serve over spaghetti. You also have a recipe for pork chops with spaghetti, which Italians nowadays also consider a no-no, since pasta and meat dishes should be separated.
With crispy chicken that will just take it over the top. Hello and welcome.
Oh, have you seen that? That's the thing I hate the most as an Italian. You get the pasta and the chicken on top. That's so bad for us. It's an offense for our culture. Italians, the most things that we're proud of is the food. But you can't serve me that pasta with the fried chicken on top. We don't do this stuff.
My point is that Italian Americans had experienced a lot of changes. Going from a place of poverty to a place of relative abundance, from interacting only with people in the same region to a place with people from many regions, and a different natural environment resulting in different ingredients they have to use in cooking. This was what gave rise to Italian American cuisine, with dishes like spaghetti with meatballs and chicken parmigiana. A northern Italian who emigrated from Italy to the US in the 1920s and later became a restaurant owner, had remarked that Italian American food was just for fun called Italian. But he also found dishes like spaghetti with meatballs and chicken parmigiana highly satisfying, and thinks someone in Italy should invent them for the Italians. Similarly, Fettuccine Alfredo had evolved from a dish served specifically to tourists to an Italian American classic with cream or even chicken. This is only my opinion, but having read through the history of the dish, I think it is reasonable to say that Fettuccine Alfredo, the version with cream, is an Italian American dish and is different from the Italian pasta al burro e parmigiano. It is also different from Alfredo Di Lelio's masterful rendition of pasta al burro e parmigiano. These are essentially three different dishes, which are each created in their own unique circumstances. Cooking and eating the different Alfredos or pasta al burro should also inform you how different each tastes. Italian American Fettuccine Alfredo with cream is richer and heavier in taste, serving as a complete meal with the addition of protein. Pasta al burro captures more of the delicate flavors of the noodles, with the butter and parmesan serving as a seasoning. Fettuccine Alfredo by the chef Alfredo uses more quantities of high quality butter and parmesan, giving a rich, nutty flavor that is surprisingly less cloying than Italian American Alfredo. Again, that is simply my opinion, your taste buds might be different. But ultimately, I'm not the one who decides what a dish should be called. All I know is that the ancestors of Italian Americans worked for their descendants' freedom to eat meat and cream. It is perfectly okay to be proud for individual Italians. Alfredo Di Lelio popularized and catalyzed a little part of Italian American history, and his food had to be good to achieve this. But as I see it, calling it the original recipe feels a bit incorrect, and calling it the only and correct way would be denying Italian American history. So anyway, that's the end of me comparing my research with tasting histories. To be clear, I am not a food historian or a sociologist. I am just a fat boy on the internet who spent weeks or sometimes months before making videos. And I guess it is time for me to beg. So, did you know that in my previous video I actually used fake Parmesan cheese? Parmigiano Reggiano is expensive. More expensive than a lifetime revenue of $6.20 for my channel. Please feed me, or else I'll be forced to change my channel name to just a thin boy.